My name is Jack Connors. I was a corporal in the 25th Infantry Division during the Vietnam War in 1968. I was 20 years old when I first landed in Vietnam, fresh out of basic training and thrown into the middle of a war I barely understood. My unit was stationed near Siu Chi, where the Viet Cong had tunnels dug so deep and so well that they could disappear into the earth like ghosts. We were young, scared, and mostly clueless, but we had a job to do. The jungle didn't care about your fear or your inexperience. It swallowed you whole either way. I still remember the first time I held my M16 rifle. It felt strange in my hands, too light to be the thing I'd have to rely on to keep me alive. My squad carried grenades too, M26s, but you didn't think about that until you had to use one. Everything else was basic: combat fatigues, boots that never seemed to dry, and just enough gear to keep you moving. It was September when the event I'm going to tell you about happened. I don't think I'll ever forget it. We were tasked with clearing a small village called Phu Bai. It wasn't just a mission, it was the kind of thing that could decide whether some of us got to go home. Intel said the village was being used as a supply hub for the Viet Cong JZ. 66 trucks were reportedly seen coming and going at night, carrying ammunition and weapons. The day started early. Our platoon of 30 men moved out just as the sun began to rise. The air was thick, heavy, and smelled of wet earth and rotting vegetation. The jungle felt alive in a way that was unsettling. Every rustle in the bushes, every chirp of an insect seemed like it could be the sound of death approaching. Our squad leader, Sergeant Baker, was a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was maybe 5 years older than the rest of us, but carried himself like he had been in the army forever. He didn't sugarcoat anything. "Keep your heads on a swivel," he said, his voice low but firm. "The Viet Cong know this terrain better than we ever will." We moved in a staggered column, stepping cautiously through the dense undergrowth. The village wasn't far, maybe 2 clicks away, but it felt like it took hours to get there. By the time we reached the outskirts, the sun was high in the sky, and the heat was oppressive. Sweat dripped down my face, soaking into my uniform, but I didn't dare wipe it away. My hands gripped the M16 so tightly that my fingers ached. When we got our first look at Phu Bai, it seemed quiet, too quiet. The village was small, just a cluster of wooden huts with thatched roofs. Chickens scratched at the dirt, and a few children played near a well. It looked peaceful, but we knew better. The Viet Cong had a way of blending in, hiding in plain sight until it was too late. Sergeant Baker motioned for us to fan out and secure the perimeter. My buddy Mike and I were assigned to check one of the larger huts near the edge of the village. Mike was my closest friend in the unit. He was from Chicago, a tough kid who never backed down from anything. We'd been through basic together, and if I trusted anyone with my life, it was him. As we approached the hut, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I kept my rifle raised, ready for anything. Mike was right beside me, his face set in a grim expression. We didn't see anything unusual at first, just a few pots and pans, some straw mats, and a wooden table. But then Mike froze, his eyes locked on something under the table. "Jack," he whispered, his voice tight. "Look." I followed his gaze and saw it. A claymore mine, rigged to a tripwire that stretched across the doorway. My stomach dropped. One wrong step, and this whole hut would have gone up in flames, taking us with it. "Jesus," I muttered, carefully backing out of the hut. "What now?" Mike shook his head, his eyes never leaving the mine. "We gotta tell Baker. This place is rigged." We slowly made our way back to the center of the village, where the rest of the squad was gathered. Sergeant Baker was talking to a group of villagers, his M16 slung across his chest. I could see the tension in his posture, the way his eyes kept scanning the area even as he spoke. When we told him about the mine, his expression hardened. "All right," he said. "This changes things. If they got traps, they've got people watching." He ordered the squad to regroup and start searching the village more carefully. Every step we took felt like it could be our last. The Viet Cong were masters of setting traps and using the environment to their advantage. They didn't fight fair, but then again, neither did we. As we searched, the villagers grew increasingly uneasy. I couldn't blame them. To them, we were the invaders stomping through their homes with guns and boots. But I also couldn't shake the feeling that some of them knew more than they were letting on. One man, an older guy with a weathered face, kept glancing toward a small grove of trees on the edge of the village. It was subtle, but I noticed it, and so did Sergeant Baker. "Jack, Mike," he said, jerking his head toward the grove. "Check it out." We moved cautiously, our rifles at the ready. The grove was dense, the trees casting long shadows that made it hard to see. My nerves were on edge. Every muscle in my body coiled like a spring. As we pushed deeper into the grove, I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like someone trying to move quietly through the underbrush. Mike and I exchanged a glance, and he nodded. We spread out, moving in a slow arc to flank whoever or whatever was out there. My heart was pounding again, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't breathe, didn't blink, just kept moving. And then I saw them. 2 Viet Cong fighters, crouched behind a fallen log, their AK-47s pointed toward the village. They didn't see me, not at first, and for a moment I froze. They looked so young, not much older than me, but their faces were hard, their eyes sharp. These weren't kids, they were killers. What happened next is something I'll never forget. My grip on the M16 tightened as I stared at those 2 Viet Cong fighters. My breathing was shallow. Each inhale, almost a gasp. Mike was to my left, inching closer. He motioned to me with 2 fingers, a silent signal to take the one on the right while he took the one on the left. It should have been simple, a textbook maneuver. But there's nothing simple about staring down the barrel of a gun at someone who doesn't even know you're there yet. For a split second, I hesitated. They were just kids, really. Dirty, hungry-looking kids who had probably grown up in this jungle. But then I thought about the Claymore mine under that table, about what it could have done to me, Mike, and anyone else who walked through that doorway. I exhaled slowly and gave a small nod. Mike was ready. Just as I started to pull the trigger, a loud crack echoed through the grove. I thought it was my own shot at first, but it wasn't. The Viet Cong had heard us. One of them whipped around, his AK-47 spraying bullets in our direction. I dropped to the ground instinctively, my ears ringing from the sudden gunfire. Mike didn't flinch. He took aim and fired a clean, single shot. The Viet Cong on the left crumpled instantly. I scrambled to my knees, my rifle snapping up, and squeezed the trigger. The other one went down before he could get another shot off. The jungle was silent again, except for the pounding of my heart and the rustle of leaves as their bodies hit the ground. "You good?" Mike asked, his voice steady but quiet. "Yeah," I said, swallowing hard. "You?" He nodded, wiping sweat off his face with his sleeve. "Let's see what they were up to." We moved toward the log where the 2 fighters had been hiding. Scattered around them were supplies, ammo crates, hand-drawn maps, and something that made my stomach twist, a radio. They were calling someone, Mike muttered, picking it up, or about to. I looked at the maps. They showed positions, trails, and even some markings near our base at Siu Chi. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a couple of random fighters hiding in the woods. This was a recon team, and they knew where we were. "Baker needs to see this," I said, gathering up the maps. But before we could move, there was more rustling from deeper in the grove. A lot more. My head snapped up, and I saw them. 6 more Viet Cong, emerging from the trees like shadows. Mike saw them too, and for a second, I thought we were both dead. "Run!" Mike shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me toward the village. We tore through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces and arms. Bullets zipped past us, thudding into trees and kicking up dirt. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were about to burst, but I didn't stop. Neither did Mike. When we broke through the edge of the grove, the village came into view. "Contact!" Mike yelled, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Viet Cong in the grove. 6, maybe more." Sergeant Baker didn't waste a second. He barked orders, and the squad snapped into action, taking cover behind huts and carts. The villagers scattered, their screams mixing with the sharp crack of gunfire as the Viet Cong burst out of the trees. I dove behind a pile of sandbags near the well, fumbling to reload my M16. Mike was next to me, his face grim. "We're sitting ducks here," he said. He was right. The Viet Cong were better positioned, using the tree line for cover. They had the high ground, and their shots were getting closer and closer. One of our guys, a kid named Harris, went down, clutching his shoulder as blood soaked through his uniform. I don't know what came over me then. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe it was pure desperation. But I knew we couldn't just sit there and wait to get picked off. "I'm going for the radio," I shouted to Mike. "What? Are you insane? Cover me." I didn't give him a chance to argue. I grabbed the Viet Cong's radio from where it had landed near the edge of the grove and sprinted toward the center of the village. Bullets whizzed past me, some so close I could feel the air shift around them. My boots pounded against the dirt, my chest heaving with every step. I made it to the well and crouched behind it, fumbling with the radio. It was battered, but it still worked. I turned the dial, praying I could find our frequency. When I did, I didn't waste time. "This is Corporal Jack Connors, 25th Infantry Division. We're under heavy fire at Phu-Bai. 6 Viet Cong, possibly more, near the grove. Requesting immediate support. Over." There was a crackle of static. Then a voice came through. "Roger that, Corporal. Air support en route. ETA 5 minutes. Hold your position." 5 minutes. It felt like an eternity. By the time I got back to the sandbags, Mike was almost out of ammo. "Air support's coming," I said, sliding behind cover. "You better be right about that," he muttered, firing off another shot. The Viet Cong were getting bolder, pushing closer to the village. I could see their faces now, their eyes filled with determination. They weren't going to stop. And then, just as things were about to go south, I heard it, the unmistakable roar of helicopters. The sound was like music to my ears. I looked up and saw them. 2 Hueys swooping in low over the village. They opened fire, their machine guns tearing through the trees and sending the Viet Cong scattering. Within seconds, the tide of the battle had turned. When it was over, the grove was quiet again. The Hueys circled once before heading back, leaving behind a village littered with spent shells and silence. Sergeant Baker walked over, his face hard but relieved. "That was a hell of a move, Connors," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You saved our asses today." I didn't feel like a hero. All I could think about were the 2 Viet Cong kids behind the log, the maps in my hand, and how close we'd all come to not making it out. But we were alive, and for now, that was enough. The aftermath of the firefight felt surreal. My hands were still shaking, and my ears were ringing from the noise of gunfire and the Hueys. The adrenaline that had kept me alive just minutes earlier was draining fast, leaving me shaky and exhausted. Around me, the squad was regrouping, checking each other for injuries and collecting what we could from the Viet Cong we'd managed to take down. Harris, the kid who got hit, was leaning against a hut, clutching his bandaged shoulder. He was pale but alive. Mike had already started cracking jokes to lighten the mood, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "Hell of a day, huh?" he said, nudging me. I nodded, but didn't say much. My mind was still on those maps we'd found. They showed too much: supply lines, positions, even troop movements. If the Viet Cong knew all that, they were planning something big, and it wasn't going to be good for us. Sergeant Baker walked over, his face set like stone. "Connors, come with me. Bring those maps." I followed him to the center of the village, where the squad had set up a temporary command post. Baker spread the maps out on a wooden table, his eyes scanning every line and marking. "This isn't random," he said after a moment. "They're gearing up for something, an ambush, maybe an assault." I swallowed hard. "You think they're coming for Siu Chi?" Baker didn't answer right away. Instead, he called over Lieutenant Moore, who had been coordinating with HQ over the radio. Moore was older than most of us, a career officer who always looked like he had too much on his mind. When he saw the maps, his expression darkened. "This is bad," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "If these positions are accurate, they're planning to cut off our supply routes. If they succeed, they could isolate half the division." Baker looked at me. "Good work finding these, Connors. You and Mike might have just saved a lot of lives." The praise didn't feel real. All I could think about was how close we'd come to dying out there. But there wasn't time to dwell on it. The lieutenant ordered us to move out immediately. We needed to get back to base and deliver the intel. The problem was the Viet Cong weren't going to let us just walk away. The trek back to Siu Chi was grueling. The jungle seemed even denser than before. Every shadow and sound, putting us on edge. We moved in tight formation, rifles at the ready. I kept thinking about the radio call earlier, about how close we'd been to not making it. Mike walked beside me, his usual grin replaced by a focused scowl. "Think they're following us?" he asked quietly. "Probably," I said. "They don't want us taking this intel back." He nodded, his grip tightening on his rifle. We were about halfway back when it happened. A deafening explosion ripped through the jungle, throwing me to the ground. My ears rang, and the world spun as I tried to figure out what had just happened. "Claymore!" someone shouted. The Viet Cong had set up an ambush, and we'd walked right into it. Gunfire erupted from all sides, the crack of AK-47s cutting through the humid air. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my M16, and dove behind a fallen tree. "Contact left! Contact left!" Sergeant Baker shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. I peeked over the log and saw them. Viet Cong fighters darting through the trees, their movements almost too fast to track. They were everywhere, using the jungle to their advantage. Mike slid in beside me, breathing hard. "This is bad, Jack. Real bad." "No kidding," I said, firing a burst toward a shadowy figure in the distance. We were pinned down, outnumbered and outgunned. The squad was scattered, trying to regroup, but the Viet Cong weren't giving us a chance. Every time someone moved, a hail of bullets followed. Then I saw Harris. He was still hurt, barely able to stand, and pinned behind a small rock with no cover. A Viet Cong fighter was closing in on him, his AK raised. I didn't think. I just moved. "Cover me!" I shouted to Mike and took off, my boots pounding against the dirt. Bullets zipped past me, one so close it grazed my sleeve. I reached Harris, just as the Viet Cong fighter stepped out from behind a tree. I raised my M16 and fired. The fighter went down, his rifle clattering to the ground. "You okay?" I asked Harris, grabbing his arm and hauling him to his feet. "Yeah," he said, though his face was pale, and he was trembling. "We gotta move," I said, pulling him toward better cover. Mike and Baker were laying down suppressive fire, trying to keep the Viet Cong at bay. I got Harris behind a thick tree, then turned back to the fight. The Viet Cong weren't letting up, but neither were we. The fight dragged on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. At some point, Lieutenant Moore managed to get through to HQ on the radio, calling for reinforcements. "They're sending another squad," he said, ducking behind cover. "But we have to hold until they get here." Hold. That was easier said than done. We were low on ammo, and the Viet Cong were relentless. Then Mike shouted something that made my blood run cold. "Flankers! They're trying to get around us." Sure enough, I saw them, 3 Viet Cong fighters moving through the trees, trying to outmaneuver us. If they succeeded, we'd be surrounded. "Not on my watch," I muttered. I grabbed 2 M26 grenades from my belt and took off, skirting around the edge of the fight. The flankers hadn't seen me yet, too focused on the main squad. I crept closer, my heart pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it. When I was close enough, I pulled the pins and threw both grenades. The explosions lit up the jungle, sending a shockwave through the trees. When the smoke cleared, the flankers were gone. Reinforcements arrived not long after that, their gunfire cutting through the Viet Cong like a knife. The tide of the battle turned, and the remaining Viet Cong melted back into the jungle. When it was over, we were battered and bruised, but alive. Sergeant Baker walked over, his face grim but relieved. "Hell of a fight," he said. "You did get out there, Connors. All of you did." I didn't feel like a hero. All I could think about was how close we'd come to losing. But as we made our way back to Siu Chi, I realized something. Sometimes survival is enough. We stumbled into the perimeter of Siu Chi just as the sun was starting to set. The base was alive with movement. Soldiers loading trucks, officers barking orders, and the constant hum of helicopters overhead. It felt strange, coming back to this place after what we'd been through. The chaos of base life seemed almost normal compared to the jungle, where every shadow could be your last. The first thing we did was report to the intelligence officer. Lieutenant Moore handed over the maps and the radio we'd taken from the Viet Cong. The officer, a sharp-eyed captain with a face like stone, didn't say much. He just scanned the maps, his expression growing darker with every passing second. "This is actionable intel," he said finally, looking up at Moore. "We need to move on this immediately." "Good work, Lieutenant." "And you," he added, glancing at me. "You've got guts, Corporal." I didn't feel like I had guts. My hands were still shaking from the fight, and my mind kept replaying the moment when I'd almost been taken out by that flanking team. But I nodded and mumbled a quiet "thank you, sir," before heading back to my squad. That night, I couldn't sleep. The barracks were quiet except for the occasional murmur of voices or the shuffle of boots on the floor. I lay on my bunk, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of the Viet Cong we'd killed. They were young like me, too young. Mike was lying on the bunk above mine. He leaned over and peered down at me. "You good, Jack?" "Yeah, elite." He didn't push. He just nodded and lay back down. But I wasn't good. I kept thinking about the maps, about the supply routes and ambush points they showed. The Viet Cong weren't just fighting us. They were planning something big. And if we didn't act fast, a lot more people were going to die. The next morning, the orders came down. Our platoon was to lead a preemptive strike on one of the positions marked on the Viet Cong maps. It was a supply depot hidden deep in the jungle, supposedly used to store weapons and ammo for their larger operations. The mission didn't sit right with me. We'd been through hell the day before, and now they were sending us right back out. But orders were orders, and there was no arguing with them. We moved out at dawn, a convoy of trucks rumbling down a dirt road that barely qualified as a path. The air was thick with humidity, and the jungle around us felt alive, watching. I sat in the back of one of the trucks with Mike and a few others, my M16 resting across my lap. No one talked much. We all knew what we were heading into. After about an hour, the truck stopped. We dismounted and started moving on foot, fanning out in a staggered formation. The jungle was even thicker here than near Phu Bai, the trees so dense they blocked out most of the sunlight. Sergeant Baker was at the front, his eyes scanning the terrain like a hawk. "Stay sharp," he said. "If this is their depot, they're going to defend it with everything they've got." We moved slowly, every step deliberate. My boots sank into the soft ground, and the sound of insects buzzed in my ears. I kept my rifle up, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. About 100 meters in, we found the first sign of trouble, a tripwire stretched across the path. Baker spotted it just in time, motioning for us to stop. He knelt down and carefully disarmed it, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. "They know we're coming," he said, standing up. "Be ready." We pressed on more cautiously now. The jungle seemed to close in around us, the air growing heavier with every step. And then we saw it, the depot. It wasn't much to look at, just a series of camouflage huts and wooden crates stacked under tarps. But the moment we saw it, the jungle exploded with gunfire. "Contact!" Baker shouted, diving for cover. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering wood and kicking up dirt. I threw myself behind a fallen log, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of the chaos. The Viet Cong were everywhere, their AK-47s flashing through the undergrowth. Mike slid in beside me, firing his M16 in controlled bursts. "They were waiting for us," he shouted. "No king." I yelled back, returning fire. The firefight was brutal. The Viet Cong had the high ground and knew the terrain better than we ever could. But we had the element of surprise on our side, at least for the first few minutes. At one point, I saw a grenade arc through the air, heading straight for our position. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it back toward the Viet Cong. It exploded mid-air, sending shrapnel flying through the jungle. "Nice throw," Mike said, grinning despite the chaos. "Shut up and shoot." I shot back, my adrenaline surging. The fight dragged on, each side refusing to give an inch. Slowly, we began to push forward, using the terrain as best we could. I don't know how long we fought, but by the time the depot was secure, my arms felt like lead, and my ears were ringing from the constant gunfire. Baker ordered us to search the area, and what we found confirmed our worst fears. The depot was loaded with weapons, AKs, RPGs, and enough ammo to supply a small army. But that wasn't the worst of it. In one of the huts, we found documents. Plans. They detailed an attack on Chi, scheduled for just 2 days from now. Baker called it in immediately, his voice grim. This changes everything, he said. We had stopped one operation, but the war was far from over. We didn't have much time to process what we'd found at the depot. The intel we uncovered, the maps, the documents, painted a clear picture. The Viet Cong were planning a coordinated assault on Chi, and if they succeeded, it would be catastrophic. Supplies, reinforcements, and morale would all take a major hit. After calling it in, Sergeant Baker told us to dig in and wait for extraction. The jungle was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that made your skin crawl. I kept my M16 close, my eyes scanning the tree line for any movement. Mike crouched beside me, reloading his rifle. Think they'll try to hit us again before we leave? Wouldn't be surprised, I said, my voice low. We didn't have to wait long to find out. It started with a single shot, echoing through the trees. One of our guys, Taylor, dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. Then the jungle erupted with gunfire, and we were back in the thick of it. Ambush! Baker shouted, diving for cover. The Viet Cong had regrouped and were coming at us hard, their AK-47s flashing in the dim light. They knew we had their plans, and they weren't about to let us leave with them. I found myself pinned behind a tree, firing blindly into the underbrush. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Mike was a few feet away, his face grim as he fired off bursts of suppressing fire. "We're sitting ducks out here," he yelled over the noise. "Hold the line." Baker's voice cut through the chaos. "Reinforcements are on the way." The fight felt like it went on forever. The Viet Cong were relentless, using the jungle to their advantage. They moved like ghosts, appearing and disappearing so quickly it was hard to keep track. At one point, a group of them tried to flank us, using the dense undergrowth as cover. I saw them just in time and shouted a warning to Baker. "They're flanking left." "Take care of it, Connors," he barked, his rifle blazing. I grabbed a grenade from my belt and crept through the trees, my heart pounding. The flankers hadn't seen me yet, their focus on the main fight. When I was close enough, I pulled the pin and lobbed the grenade into their path. The explosion rocked the jungle, and when the smoke cleared, the flankers were gone. "Nice work," Mike called out, firing another burst. Eventually, we heard the familiar thrum of helicopters. Reinforcements had arrived. The sight of those Hueys cutting through the smoke-filled air was enough to give us a second wind. The choppers opened fire, their machine guns ripping through the trees. The Viet Cong didn't stand a chance. Within minutes, the tide of the battle had turned, and the remaining fighters melted back into the jungle. When it was over, I collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving. Around me, the squad was regrouping, checking for injuries and counting our ammo. Sergeant Baker walked over, his face grim but relieved. "Good work out there," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "You held your ground." It didn't feel like good work. It felt like survival. Back at Chi, the intel we'd recovered was immediately handed off to higher-ups. The assault on the base had been thwarted, but the war was far from over. For the next few days, the base was on high alert. Patrols were doubled, and everyone was on edge, waiting for the next attack. The jungle around us seemed alive, hiding dangers we couldn't see. I spent most of my time trying to keep busy, cleaning my rifle, writing letters home, anything to keep my mind off what had happened. But the memories wouldn't leave me alone. Late one night, Mike found me sitting outside the barracks, staring at the jungle. "Can't sleep?" he asked, sitting down beside me. "Not really," I admitted. He nodded, lighting a cigarette. "It gets to you, doesn't it?" "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the jungle filling the space between us. "You did good out there, Jack," Mike said finally. "Better than good. You saved a lot of lives." "Didn't feel like it," I said, staring at the ground. "Doesn't have to," he said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "You're still here. That's what matters." The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The war didn't stop, and neither did we. There were more missions, more firefights, and more losses. But every now and then, I'd think back to that day in the jungle, to the maps and the depot, and the fight to get back to Chi. It wasn't about glory or heroics. It was about survival, about making it through another day so you could fight for the ones who didn't. And in the end, that's all that really mattered. The months that followed were a blur of missions, ambushes, and long, grueling days in the jungle. Every time we set foot outside Suchi, it felt like we were walking into the unknown, unsure if we'd make it back or not. But somehow we did, day after day, week after week. It was in the quiet moments that the weight of it all hit me. I couldn't sleep without hearing the sounds of gunfire echoing in my head. Couldn't eat without seeing the faces of the men we lost. And sometimes, when the jungle was still and the world felt a little too quiet, I'd hear the sounds of those young Viet Cong soldiers, their footsteps following me through the trees, just like they had on that first mission. We lost men along the way, good men, brave men. Harris never fully recovered from that shoulder wound, and we lost him during a skirmish near the Cambodian border. Taylor, the guy who got shot in the leg during the ambush, had to be sent home. He never came back, but we kept going. We had to. One day, the orders came down that we were being rotated out. I was both relieved and heartbroken. I was tired, yes, but the thought of leaving my brothers in arms behind felt wrong. But it wasn't about choice. It was just how the war worked. We boarded the transport, the engines roaring to life as we left Siuchi behind. As the helicopter lifted off, I looked back at the base one last time. For a second, I thought I saw a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees, watching us leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. We were going home. But the war would never truly leave us.